Tell me.
Okay, good.
All right, great. Well, thank you all for joining us tonight. This is Willamette Riverkeeper's legal update and kind of a summary of stuff we have been working on over the past couple of years. It's not comprehensive, not every issue or case is covered, but you get a good sense of what we've been up to. We encourage you to ask questions. We'll have some time at the end for that, and we'll answer them as best we can. My name is Travis Williams, and I'm Riverkeeper and Executive Director of Willamette Riverkeeper. And Heather King, our Deputy Director, is facilitating this meeting along with Amanda Gallegos, who's our Outreach Manager. And so we're all on here tonight. And then, of course, Elizabeth Holmes, who I'll be introducing here in a minute, our staff attorney. Over the years, Willamette Riverkeeper has engaged in a lot of different issues, and we educate, we advocate, and occasionally we take legal action to protect water quality and habitat. And that's really what it's all about. In 1996, we were the 13th riverkeeper organization in the United States. And of course, now there's over 300 worldwide baykeeper, coastkeeper, and of course, riverkeepers. And the fundamental thing that our organizations agree to do and have to agree to do in order to utilize the name is to take action under the Clean Water Act, be willing to file a 60-day notice and to continue on with a lawsuit. And that is just a very fundamental thing that each and every organization has to agree to. In other countries, of course, the laws are different. And there are some cases where you don't have something that's necessarily directly analogous to the Clean Water Act, but they make a similar commitment is the point. Over the years, Willamette Riverkeeper has engaged in a lot of different legal actions. Typically, it's not the first tool in our toolkit, but there are many cases where it's the exact tool that you need and very appropriate for the situation. And Eli will talk about different examples tonight, of course. But we have, since 2001, since I've been involved in 2000, I think 2001, we took our first action against a pulp mill in Oregon City called Blue Heron. Of course, that eventually closed down, and there were numerous violations with that particular facility. We've done stormwater cases. We've done cases against the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers related to fish passage and recovering wild threatened fish under the Endangered Species Act. And there have been numerous other ways that we've engaged legally. And so building up to about 3 years ago when Eli agreed to join us as staff attorney, we'd had just a number of cases. And I think we've really kind of made a commitment to do more on that front because there is definitely a need. And so without further ado, I want to introduce Elizabeth Holmes, Willamette Riverkeeper's staff attorney, who's going to talk about all of this. So thanks again for coming tonight.
Thanks, Travis. Thanks, everyone, for joining us tonight. We really appreciate you taking the time and your interest as well in the legal work that we're doing. Environmental law is never dull, and tonight we'll take you through some of the issues that we're working on. And we'll, like Travis and Heather mentioned, we'll plan on addressing questions at the end. But if I see something that pops up in a chat and I can address it sort of simultaneously, I'll try and do that. The PowerPoint will be available after the presentation. I'm going to lay out one way of how we can talk about things here, because obviously covering 187 miles of the river over diverse land uses, over local, state, federal, and even private lands, and addressing everything from pollution to conservation. There's a lot of different ways that we can work on protecting the river and protecting water quality. And so I was thinking about tonight, like, what's the easiest way to try and put together sort of an understanding of the strategy that we have. And there's a concept that pulls actually from international law, which focuses first on the access to information. The second piece is the right to public participation. And the third is access to justice, access to the court system. And I lay things out that way as well, because I know that there's a future a potential future law student on the call tonight too. So hopefully she'll find that instructive. So with that brief overview, let's dive in. Heather, if you could go to slide 3, thank you. So regarding access to information, probably a lot of you have heard of the Freedom of Information Act, and you know about public records requests, which can be done. And so one of the actions that we have going on is we heard in early 2019 that the Army Corps of Engineers was looking at the 13 federal dams in the Willamette River Basin because it was concerned that they were high or moderate risk of failure in the event of a Cascadian subduction event. Well, usually we talk about dams in the Willamette Valley because of water quality issues and water access issues. And we know that dams are devastating for salmon. We know that they're bad for wildlife, that they can damage rivers, they can destroy river ecosystems, but they also provide irrigation water, they prevent flooding, and they can provide energy. But one thing we didn't know is that because the dams in the Willamette Valley are so old, they're around 50 to 75 years old, a lot of them have exceeded their engineering life expectancy. That's not even accounting for a potential Cascadian subduction event. So when we learned that the Corps was evaluating them, not just because of their age, but also because of the potential risk, we submitted a FOIA request to the Corps, and we didn't get a response. We had waited and waited, and we didn't get a response. So we decided to sue them under the Freedom of Information Act, which is a federal law. So we sued in federal court. Since we filed our suit, we've received approximately 73,000 pages of information. I estimate that that's probably not even a quarter of what the Corps needs to provide us with. So there's a lot of information that they've been gathering that has not yet been released in the public domain. And our job is to make sure that it does get into the public domain. And while we're still reviewing what we're getting, I'd say I can put it into 2 categories. One is reports and textual descriptions about what's going on. And then the other side of it is graphs and maps and schematics. So we're in the process of sort of weeding out what is duplicative, what's the most relevant, and what would be the most useful for the public to have at their disposal. I will say, though, that our initial impression is that the Corps has concerns with structural integrity of the dams, that there's concerns and problems with the dams themselves functioning properly in the event of an earthquake. And there's also concerns and problems with notifying the public and planning. So, our goal is to bring this information to the public to the extent that it can help the public, it can help emergency managers. And also because there's so much work being considered to be done to the dams as part of fish passage issues, if there's some way to integrate any fixes at the same time, then those should be done without delay. If you could go, okay, thanks, Heather. One thing I wanted to point out regarding the Freedom of Information Act is that even though it's called the Freedom of Information Act, the information is not free. Under federal and state public records laws, nonprofit organizations like Willamette Riverkeeper are categorized as other requesters. We're not an education facility. We're not a corporation. We're not an individual. We're not doing scientific research. So as an other requester, we actually have to specifically ask for the agency to waive fees for the FOIA request. And those fees usually are for their staff time to search for responsive records, to produce them to us if they send it on a thumb drive or a CD. That all takes time. And we have to affirmatively show that the information we're obtaining will be used to benefit the general public that the information is not already in the public domain, that Willamette Riverkeeper has the ability to inform the public about the government operation and activities on the specific issue. And so a lot of our time is actually spent pushing to get information for free. That said, with respect to the Army Corps of Engineers FOIA that we did on the dams, we did get a fee waiver. But at the same time, there's smaller instances where we have not gotten them. For example, earlier this year, we learned about a factory in a small town on the Willamette that's seeking a new pollution permit. And we want to submit public comments. We want them to know what Willamette Riverkeeper thinks about the history of pollution of this particular facility and how it affects the river. But the agency said it was going to charge us $1,000 just to get basic permit documents. It's unusual to be charged fees, and it's unusual to have them be around $1,000, but it's not that unusual that it was completely unexpected. So just so you know, as part of the work that we do, a lot of it is trying to mitigate costs to effectuate our basic right to information. If you could go to the next slide, Heather, thanks. So the sort of second pillar of the kind of work that we do is this area, what I'll call public participation. And so the best example is a couple of projects we are working on this fall. In the Willamette River Basin, it's one of the richest and most diverse agricultural areas in the United States. And I've even seen some sources say that it's one of the richest areas in the world. We have a variety of different kinds of agriculture, including animal agriculture, which means beef, dairy, poultry, duck, goat, sheep, alpaca, and we also have a lot of mink farms, which you've probably heard about too. With so many animals, you obviously get manure. And EPA and Oregon DEQ requires certain operations, certain animal agricultural operations, to get a Clean Water Act permit, because given the amount of water that we have in the Willamette River Basin and the interconnection of our rivers and streams, there's risks of manure getting into surface water and into groundwater if it's not properly managed. And so the Clean Water Act permits ostensibly try and protect our rivers. You've probably also heard recently in the news about facilities up in Boardman and that area where like the Lost Valley CAFO and Easter Day that were permitted, and they had a lot of problems and issues with groundwater contamination. So those facilities are really, really large, like 30,000 cows. Most of the operations in the Willamette Valley are what we consider smaller, medium-sized facilities. So let's say 700 dairy cows or 30,000 chickens. And we haven't yet seen a large number of these very, very large facilities in the Willamette River Basin. And I use yet in underlined format because we actually are starting to see some. And so this fall, the state of Oregon issued their new Clean Water Act permit for all CAFOs in the state of Oregon. And we joined forces with the Center for Food Safety, Food and Water Watch, and some other organizations to put together comments lining up a potential challenge to the Oregon state permit. There were some good things about this permit and that it recognized these large facilities, but they also didn't go as far as we wanted it to go. And there's been some recent decisions from other states just this year that we previously sent to ODA, where we told them, look, other states are being more restrictive on these operations to protect water. Oregon needs to do so too. Unfortunately, Oregon decided not to do that. So if you could go to the next slide. And I'll just for context, I'm using animal agriculture and factory farm and CAFO. It's all kind of different words for the same kind of very, very large animal farm. a CAFO is the EPA definition of one of these entities. It's defined by regulation based on specific numbers, and it's called a concentrated animal feeding operation. So we abbreviate that as CAFO. Some people say CAFO, tomato. Yeah. So like I said, we've been lucky in that in the Willamette Valley, we haven't yet seen a lot of these very, very large ones, like the one up in the Boardman area. However, earlier this year, we were contacted by a community in the North Santiam, just outside of Scio. And they had heard that a Foster Farm, so all of you have probably heard of Foster Farms, it's a large chicken producer, and a Foster Farms chicken CAFO, or Foster Farms factory farm, was going to come in. And the way that this arrangement works is Foster Farms contracts with a local person, and that local person raises the chickens, and then Foster Farms comes and picks them up and takes them to a slaughterhouse for processing. All the manure that those chickens produce, it stays right there. It stays on site. So wherever the chickens are grown, that's where the manure stays. And so it becomes a problem in particular areas that are very prone to water infiltration, and choosing a site like this one on the North Santiam is just a very, very bad idea. So on the North Santiam, there's a particular stretch just east of Scio called the Wiseman Island Reach. And it's got some of the most complex river habitat on that section of the river. It's great for salmon. It's a really low-lying, complicated area, and there's wetlands on both sides of the river that are part of the river system. And in some years, it's just, an extension of the river overall. This particular area is often flooded. A lot of the community members that live nearby, some of them are right next door, told us that they see, geese and ducks on there all the time. As the river descends from the North Santiam towards the Willamette, there's water that drains from the entire subbasin across and sheets across the low-lying area. And there's these traditional flow pathways for the water, which run across the top of the ground and through the soil. So this whole area is very, very wet. Unfortunately, this Foster Farms person decided that's the best place to build one of these very, very large CAFOs. This guy wants to build a 3.4 million chicken operation right here in this wet area. And it's going to store approximately 6 months of manure and compost and dead birds. And then there's going to be hundreds of semi-trucks carting feed in and birds out pretty frequently. If you could go to the next slide, Heather. So some of the concerns that we have for the river are on the wildlife front. The top picture here is a winter steelhead that someone that lives nearby found in the river. So we know that there's native fish in the area. We also know that there's freshwater mussel populations in the North Santiam River. The kinds of pollution that these CAFOs can emit through the manure is potentially devastating to any river, and in particular a place like the North Santiam that feeds the Willamette River with lots of cool, clean, clear water. If you could go to the next slide. So Willamette Riverkeeper joined forces with a local community organization called Farmers Against Foster Farms and other groups in Oregon, the Center for Food Safety again. And we had a number of other community groups sign on to our letter. We also testified at the Oregon Department of Agriculture. We submitted written public comments. And unfortunately, because the Oregon Department of Agriculture's default is really to just accept these permits and not do a significant amount of due diligence, we had to push back really hard. And because this location is so pristine, that was one of our key arguments. But to make this argument, we really had to do more than just write it up for them. We really had to explain it to them step by step by step. And so one of the things that we did is we hired a stormwater and floodplains mapping expert to really lay out the problem for us. If you can go to the next slide, please. So this is a LiDAR analysis map of the particular area. And you can see on the upper portion of the map, that's the North Santiam River flowing through the Wiseman Island Reach area. And there's an area in a black outline in the center of the map called FEMA Flood Zone X. And basically this map shows different floodplain areas within where this CAFO is supposed to be sited. And all of the blue lines that you see are traditional floodplains where water has flown and will continue to flow regardless of what you put on it. And this particular CAFO has decided to site all of the 3.4 million birds on these blue lines. So basically they're proposing to build the barns, which are not going to have a liner underneath them on top of traditional floodplains. So, 6 months of manure will leach through the soil because there's nothing to protect it, and it'll get directly into the groundwater. So this is a major problem, but we really think that this particular argument about the location and trying to spell it out for the Oregon Department of Agriculture will really hopeful that they're going to be able to take notice and appreciate the complexity of this area and why a permit should not be issued. If you could go to the next slide. So that CAFO issue is one of the public participation issues that we work on, where we have to essentially build the case, we attend hearings, we give testimony, and we really try and show the agency the better way of doing things to protect the Willamette River. Another example is Glenwood in the Springfield area down here in Eugene, which is where I'm located. And I think that Daphne Mantis is on the line too. She's one of the big supporters of this effort down in that area. And so what's happening down in Springfield is there's a 9-acre parcel of land right on the river that used to be used for various industries and different uses, but the city of Springfield has invested a lot of time and effort in getting access to this parcel. It's got about 400 feet of riverfront, and Springfield has said, we're going to build 12-story hotels, we're going to have big baseball and soccer stadiums, and we're going to build a convention center and parking garages. But at the same time, the city of Springfield is trying to market this piece of property to developers by saying that it's one of the last and best places on the Willamette River that you can do this kind of development. And they're really touting that as a marketing tool. But at the same time, nothing that we have seen to date really demonstrates that they're going to integrate basic protections for the river or require basic protections of the river be shown as part of the process of determining who's going to be the developer. So there's a couple of things going on here. The first is that there's no set process or procedure that the city of Springfield has to follow to vet potential developers. And so we have tried to insert ourselves in communications with the city of Springfield to say, if you don't have a process, we're going to basically lay one out for you, because you need to have something in place that is fair and equitable, considers the environment, and considers also the local community members. We've also tried to advocate for examples of what these protections could look like. Because again, the Willamette River, most of it's critical habitat for threatened species. We're concerned about water quality. We're concerned, especially with the kind of construction that they're talking about here, that there's going to be a significant amount of stormwater runoff. And so there's a lot of different things that can be done on the procedural front and on the substantive front that we are trying to use the public participation process for, to really push the city of Springfield to do the right thing. So what we do know is that they only got one bid so far. So if you could go to the next slide, Heather, I think that'll give people sort of an idea of, where this is, the kind of property that we're talking about. There's a lot of room for development. I think it's around, so 400 feet is the riverfront area. And then I think the entire property is about 1,000, maybe 1,500 feet long. So there's a fair amount of space for them to work with. And so we're concerned about protecting the river, and we want the city of Springfield to do the right thing. And because there isn't really a set public participation process, we are trying to encourage them to create one. So the last sort of section that I'll talk about is this concept of access to justice or access to the court system. Like Travis mentioned, this is something that is a tool for us, but it's not our first tool. We can use other methods first, like sometimes just asking for information, because under the public records laws, when an agency gets a public records request, usually the first thing they do is they turn around and notify the entity that we're asking about. So if there's a polluting facility in the city of Eugene and I submit a public records request, normally what's going to happen is the agency is going to pick up the phone and call that polluter and be like, hey, Willamette Riverkeeper is asking questions about you. So sometimes that is enough to kind of get someone on the right track. The other is this public process piece, right? So if we can essentially make our case during the public process and public notice time, it allows us to show an agency or show a potential polluter or someone that has to deal with conservation issues, show them a better way to do things. But if that doesn't work, we have the court system. And there's been a couple of cases that we've been working on. I was just going to highlight a couple of them. There's definitely some other things going on, but I think these are the ones that we're most able to talk about today. So the first is what I'll call Zenith 1 and Zenith 2. If you've heard of Zenith Energy in Portland in the industrial area, they've been coming under a lot of scrutiny because of their A, they're a fossil fuel terminal, B, they're not really decreasing their amount of fossil fuels, but they're trying to look more at doing renewable fuels. And so obviously from a climate perspective, this is a super important issue for everyone. And also the city of Portland has their declaration, I'm going to call it the declaration, but that's not the right word, about climate change and how the city is trying to set certain goals and work towards a cleaner climate for all people in Portland and as the state of Oregon, because this is such an essential component of the infrastructure. But what happened is that there's a piece of property that Zenith owns that they just decided to, thank you. They decided to start constructing a renewable fuels terminal on. But when you start to do construction, again, enter the Clean Water Act, you have to get a permit to do your construction to ensure that when you start moving dirt around and when you start moving rocks, that there's not silt running off into the river. And Zenith didn't get one. They just went ahead and started to do their construction. So we engaged a stormwater expert who was able to do an analysis for us as to what Zenith was doing and what they were not doing. And we were able to get Zenith via the lawsuit to change their practices, to implement certain construction stormwater protection measures. The DEQ actually got involved too, and the DEQ gave them a fine. We also succeeded in getting Zenith to provide a supplemental environmental project, which benefits the Portland Audubon in the amount of $115,000. And I think that's going to primarily go to their, is it called the backyard birding program? Which I understand has been super popular. And also because it's a Clean Water Act action, which is a fee shifting statute, and because we were successful, Zenith paid our attorney's fees. So we thought that had resolved that primary issue. However, it didn't succeed in stopping Zenith from proceeding with constructing the renewable facility, and they still had to get permits from the city of Portland. And that came in the form of a land use application. And this was also in the news recently. So Zenith applied for a land use application to the city of Portland. The city of Portland denied it because this expansion of the renewable fuels facility is inconsistent with the climate resolution that Portland has put forth. And Zenith disagreed with that conclusion and filed a petition for review now in state court at the Land Use Board of Appeals. And so Willamette Riverkeeper and Columbia Riverkeeper have filed a motion and now a brief to intervene in that to support the city of Portland's conclusions and their protections for the Willamette River. And so in that case, we're also working with the Cragg Law Center because they have some really good expertise in land use law. And that actually just got filed not even 10 days ago. So that's a pretty new thing that we're working on. Another avenue that we're taking is using NEPA, which is the National Environmental Policy Act. NEPA requires environmental review for major federal actions. And typically you can hear about NEPA being used to block a timber sale or something is a violation of NEPA because a federal agency is going to construct a new water terminal, but they didn't consider how that's going to affect salmon or how it's going to affect mussels or threatened species. But NEPA is designed to protect the human environment, which includes the environment, but also human health. And we, in light of what happened with the social justice protests in the city of Portland in 2020 and 2021, we were concerned, given the proximity of some of the Department of Homeland Security actions against protesters, the proximity of those actions to the Willamette River, we were concerned about some of the chemicals getting into the Willamette River. And we actually have folks that were able to identify things like tear gas canisters and other kinds of bullets and other materials in the storm drains, and then, walk down to where the storm drain discharges into the Willamette River, and lo and behold, there's, chemical munitions coming out of the storm drains into the river and floating in the river. So given that we didn't know exactly what these chemicals were, and we had done a fair amount of due diligence beforehand. We had submitted several FOIA requests. We had had conversations with state and federal entities. We connected with our local representatives, trying to get information, and no one was getting information. We also connected with groups like NCAP, which is the Northwest Center for Alternatives to Pesticides, Cascadia Wildlands, Neighbors for Clean Air, which is based in Portland, and 350 PDX, all of whom were concerned about this intersection of social justice, environmental justice, and the impacts of the chemicals to the environment, but also the impacts of the chemicals on the protesters. And in many cases, people that weren't even attending the protests. A lot of our folks that have come forward didn't even attend the protests, and they were affected by tear gas in their homes. So there's a pretty vast array of impacts that these chemicals had. And so the basic thing that's required under NEPA is to identify the chemicals and to release to the public an analysis of the potential impacts. And the Department of Homeland Security under the Trump administration has refused, had refused, and then also so far with the Biden administration, we haven't seen a significant change in position on that front. So we ended up, the Department of Homeland Security filed a motion to dismiss our case. We had a hearing in July. We did not win on the motion to dismiss, and we filed a notice of appeal. And we're currently in briefing at the Ninth Circuit, and we'll be having oral argument, hopefully, probably in early 2000 or mid 2022. And this is a pretty exciting case in terms of it being a novel issue. But I think a lot of us are of the opinion that, it's important to protect the river. It's important to protect public health, and these issues that impact social justice, especially given the folks that were attending the protests, or not even attending, but that were affected by it, is really important. So another case that we're working on in the court system, which is a little bit more of a traditional case, is the what we call the Summer Steelhead case. So the Corps, it's the Corps, I think, that's releasing or managing the hatchery program for summer steelhead. And obviously winter steelhead are in great jeopardy. And we're using NEPA and the Endangered Species Act to argue that this program of hatchery is inconsistent with federal law. And in that case, we just, we're going back and forth on the administrative record, and we'll be probably deciding next steps just after the holidays. If you could go to the next slide. So one of the big things that we've been working on with Cascadia Wildlands and Oregon Wild and Crag as well is all of the post-fire timber sales. There have been a number of timber sales from the Forest Service, from the BLM, and also from the state of Oregon, excuse me, seeking to log the areas that were burnt by the 2020 fires. And you can imagine in the Willamette River Basin that this is, hundreds of thousands of acres of land. And there's been a lot of press about it in terms of what kind of logging is being done and how it's being done. And we've been following this as best we can because it's probably one of the fastest moving trains I've ever seen. And we've got 3 lawsuits currently now, 1 in state court and 2 in federal court. And one of the major problems with these lawsuits is that the federal agencies have been arguing that they don't need to do NEPA review at all, because all of the logging that they're trying to do falls under what we call a categorical exclusion. And a categorical exclusion means no NEPA review, because in this case, they're saying it's just road maintenance and repair, right? So they're saying all we need to do is take out the trees that are in danger of falling on people or passengers or work crews in the forest. But given the quantity of trees and the quantity of area that they're logging and that they're describing they're going to be logging in their basic documents, this is not just road maintenance or repair. If you could go to the next slide, Heather, sorry. So these are just a couple of pictures. It's been difficult to access these areas because they are closed, but there's been a couple of folks that have been able to get pictures. And so those are coming out through some of the posts that we're doing, some of the posts that Cascadia Wildlands is doing, and also OPB has been doing some coverage of this as well. And why is Willamette Riverkeeper interested in this? It's not just because it's in the basin, but it's because the health of the forest is tied integrally to the water quality of the waters in the forest, which then offer the clean, clear water that feeds into the Willamette. So it's really critical to protect the watersheds, the headwaters of all of the creeks and streams that feed into the Willamette River. Last week, we had an amazing win in the federal court in the District of Eugene regarding the Willamette 2020 fires, which basically is Lions Head, Beachy Creek, and Holiday Farm fires. And it was on the issue of this road maintenance and repair approach that the government is taking. And Judge McShane in Eugene allowed us to have a preliminary injunction, which is really, really rare. And so we now have a ruling that essentially says the Forest Service can only fall trees that have an imminent risk of failure and are within striking distance of a road. And that's a big win to set some parameters on what was otherwise a pretty expansive logging project. So those are some of the basic things that we're working on. I know it's a lot, but it covers sort of those three areas of access to information, public process, and access to the court system. And I just wanted to talk a little bit about some of the smaller points that I've raised out here recently in terms of how we actually build these cases. It's a lot of hard work. It's a lot of collaboration with other groups as well, so that we can collectively make the best use of our resources. But the other thing that we're trying to do is essentially set up what we're calling like a revolving legal fund, because if we want to move forward on an issue for protect the river, but we're getting to get the information, we're going to have to pay to get the information. Sometimes we've been finding ourselves in a situation, well, we want the information, but do we know if we're going to spend like $500 or $1,000 or more to try and get that information? And if we don't get it, how are we going to successfully challenge the permit in the public process piece if we don't have the information necessary? And then if we decide to file a lawsuit, hopefully we can avoid that by investing in the first two sections of this. But it's part of the decision-making process that we have to take on each of these issues. The lawsuits that I've been mentioning are citizen suits. One of the things that Travis mentioned earlier is the Clean Water Act. And so a lot of the work that we would like to be doing involves the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, and other environmental laws that are these citizen suit provisions that allow us to act as what's called in the law a private attorney general. So when the government doesn't act and doesn't protect the river or protect Willamette Riverkeeper's interests, we have a right to bring a lawsuit on behalf of our members and on behalf of the river. But often to build these cases and to build a successful case, we have to do our own water quality sampling, because let's say a polluter is discharging to the river and their permit says that they're supposed to track the pollution, but they don't, and the DEQ doesn't do anything to enforce it, then it's hard for us because we don't have that information. So sometimes we have to go out and do our own sampling to prove the case. Similarly with scientific experts, we need hydrogeologists and stormwater experts to be able to help us make the case as to why something should be done and should be done better to protect the river. And if we do end up in litigation, the citizen suit work, especially on the expert front, can cost money. I mean, it can cost as little as $10,000 and sometimes 50,000 or 100,000 or more. It just depends on how complex the case is. And we certainly do everything we can beforehand before we get to the point where we have to be in that situation. But sometimes if you've got a big polluter and you've got to stop them, you've got to invest a lot of time and resources to do that. And there's also procedurally protections built in. For example, we don't just sue someone, we have to, under the law, send them a 60-day notice letter, which is what Travis mentioned before. So we have to send them a letter and we have to basically give them 60 days to come into compliance. We usually offer to sit down and talk with them and come up with some kind of other arrangement. during those 60 days, also, the DEQ can step up and be like, gosh, you know what, we should take action. So Willamette Riverkeeper, you don't have to. Or EPA could say, we'll take action. Don't you worry, Willamette Riverkeeper. But sometimes they don't. And if it's a big enough problem, then we have to push forward. The thing about the citizen suits is that when we successfully win, the polluter has to pay for our costs, including attorney's fees. And these can be used to keep and build the next case. But we need to win the case in the first place. And so that's where sampling and science helps us do that. And that's also where donations that you make to the legal program can help us build that structure for current work and for ongoing work in the future. So I wanted to just thank you all for your assistance on this, and we'll take any questions later. And I know Heather and Travis probably just wanted to say something in closing on the legal issues and our plans.
So as always, I would be totally remiss if I didn't tell y'all how you can support Willamette Riverkeeper. And here's just a few ways that you can do it. It's Give Guide season, so you can make a donation through Give Guide and earn some pretty cool incentives that have been donated to us from our partners. You can make a one-time gift through our website. Amanda is putting all these links in the chat right now. You can become a monthly sustaining donor. You can mail us a check. You can make a donation of stock, and now you can actually make a donation of cryptocurrency. You can make a qualified charitable distribution from your IRA. You can volunteer with us. We have a pretty cool trash cleanup happening next Friday in Portland. Cool and important, actually. You can also attend the Wild and Scenic Film Festival on December 9th. I would also be remiss if I didn't thank those of you that are on this call that already support us as monthly donors, as major donors, as just individual donors. And we couldn't do the work that Eli has been talking about for the past almost hour without your support. It's really, really important. And so thank you very, very much for that continued support, whether you're a one-time donor or a monthly donor. If you have any questions about giving, you're always welcome to contact me, shoot me an email, or give me a phone call. And I'll stop talking about donations, and I will hand it over to Travis and Eli for questions. And it looks like there are some in the chat. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and pull up the chat and see questions. If you didn't write it in the chat and you want to ask it, just raise your hand and I'll try and see it. So the first question I can see is it possible to hold the construction companies accountable for proceeding with the work without the property owner obtaining a permit?
Yes. and so that's what we did with Zenith. They started going forward, and so we went after Zenith. We didn't go after the construction company themselves, because ultimately the entity that's responsible for actually getting the permit is Zenith, and then Zenith will contract with a construction company. So Zenith would be the permit holder, and they are the ones ultimately liable on the permit and for hold the responsibility for what's going on with their land.
These are going to bounce around a little bit, Eli, because people put them in the chat while you were talking. So another question, does the EPA permit entail an inspection? How do they manage each operation for manure pollution? So I'm assuming that has to do with the CAFOs.
Yeah, so the state of Oregon has, I think, 6 inspectors for the whole state. I think they try to visit each CAFO every 10 months, maybe every 8 months. And so they do try and do inspections. How can I say this? Most of the inspection reports that I've seen are just check boxes. And I've even seen some that say, not in Oregon, I should be fair and clarify that. Some that say, thanks for the pie and coffee. So I'm not sure how thorough inspections tend to be. That said, there's been some instances where the inspector will take photographs and make detailed notes. And so, yes, there are inspections, but I think there's a pretty wide degree of variability in terms of their thoroughness.
I think this is from Sean, and I think it has to do with the forest. Hold on. If those areas are closed to public access, how is that ruling enforced? Am I right, Sean, that has to do with the?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I know that there's some areas that are being opened up a little bit more, and I know that the press and media has been able to get a little bit of access. And I know that through CRAG, there's one person affiliated with CRAG who's been doing a lot of documentation. There's also property owners that still own their property up in there that can get up there, and that are folks that members of our team have been in contact with. So we're doing the best we can under the circumstances.
There's another question about the CAFOs. Ashley asked, has Foster Farms submitted, or any other stakeholder for that matter, any plans that show their intent to move or use the waste for biofuels?
So allegedly, the waste it'll go, this is my favorite word in the CAFO realm, it'll go away. The waste is just going to go away. So where it's going to go, I don't know, but I know that it's going to still be in the Willamette River Basin, right? It's not, because waste is very expensive to transport. And so most of the time, if you have a lot of cow manure, pig manure, chicken manure, you don't want to pay a lot of money to move it to a different site. So most likely it's going to stay in the Willamette Valley somewhere. So in my mind, it's not really going away. On the issue of biofuels, we tend to be a little bit careful because there's a lot of greenwashing that goes on. And a lot of things are being pushed, like manure digesters, but there's a lot of problems with the quantity of energy that they produce, where it's going to be used. They don't really solve the ultimate problem in that we have probably too many animals to begin with. And also, there's been studies done that show the kind of waste that you end up with at the end of this manure digester process, even after you've extracted whatever energy you can from it, that then gets applied to the land. But the problem is that tends to have even higher concentrations of nutrients like nitrate, which is mobile and can get into groundwater. So I don't know exactly what this particular ranch's plan is, other than they say it's going to go away. If it ends up in biofuel, I have concerns about what that also means for the Willamette River Basin.
Okay, thanks. I don't see any other questions in the chat box, and I don't see any raised hands. Does anybody have any final questions for Eli or Travis?
One thing I want, oh yeah, go ahead.
Oh, there's another one up here.
Can you hear
Sorry.
me?
Yeah, go ahead, Darby.
I don't know how to put the raise. Hey, I
Okay,
just
go
wanted
ahead.
to kind of, Eli, have us if about, anything going on in the Newburgh pool. This is separate from what you guys talked about. It was great on what you talked about, but I know, there's kind of an outstanding kind of intent to sue up here, and kind of wondered what's the status and what's the future, or any update on that would be really appreciated.
Yeah. That's one of those things that I'm comfortable saying a little bit about, but not too much about right now. And so, yes, we did send, just so folks that don't already know this, we did send a notice of intent to sue letter to the Oregon State Marine Board, the Oregon DEQ, and the Oregon Department of State Lands under the Endangered Species Act, basically because their activities in don't control the activity of this wake surfing or wave surfing, which is causing huge waves in the Willamette River, huge unnatural waves, and destroying the critical habitat for salmon. So we sent a notice of intent to sue letter, and we had several communications with the Department of Justice. And Darby, you probably know this too. This is going back a little while ago, that that Governor Brown apparently also sat down with the Marine Board. So we then had the legislative session this past year that Greg Leo was assiduously involved in. And my goodness, did I ever learn a lot of sausage making during those 6 weeks? Oh my God, or 8 weeks. So it is still out there, and there is work being done on it, but that's kind of all I'm comfortable saying right now.
Hey, thank you. Thanks, guys.
Thanks for the question. So we have a question from Chris that is about the logging. So what else needs to happen for the logging on the Willamette National Forest to be prevented permanently? Who has benefited financially from the logging that has been done thus far?
So what needs to be done next? So next, what happened with the judge's ruling is that the judge found that we were likely to succeed on the merits of our case. So now we do proceed on the merits of the case, which is basically moving to summary judgment. I don't have a time frame for when we're going to be doing that. Technically, the Forest Service needs to provide us with the administrative record first, but because they're doing this under a categorical exclusion, I'm not sure there's going to be much there. So I assume we're going to be moving for summary judgment at some point soon. In terms of who's making out on this, I think actually some of the best information on this or discussion on it has been in the press, in terms of it being like the logging companies and the contractors, and that enters into frankly a pretty complicated area that I don't have that much experience with. And I believe that at least one of the, trying to think if it's this timber sale or another one of the timber sales we're working on is a specific yield management area. So it's designed to make money. So I don't have a good answer for you right now on that. I'm sorry.
Hey, I wanted to jump in here and just say a couple things. I wanted to point out in the Zenith case that Willamette Riverkeeper and Columbia Riverkeeper settled with Zenith. That supplemental environmental project is something that's actually really, it's a positive result of those cases, in that instead of paying a fee that would disappear into the government, you would never see those funds again. We're able to provide funds typically to a local nonprofit that has a specific type of project that would protect water quality and habitat. So in this case, as Eli mentioned, it's the Audubon Society of Portland's backyard certification program that has done a lot of good for backyard habitats to support avian and many other types of species that we have in urban areas. So it was a really nice direct connection in that case. And the other thing, not to have this be too much of a fundraising pitch call, but the one thing about developing our legal fund and having that revolving fund that we could utilize in these cases is that it makes it much harder for the folks that are the defendants in these cases to try to wait us out and to let the clock tick until we don't have the capacity to continue to push these cases in a way that is meaningful. And we've had that happen several times over the years where people have tried that. They have not been successful and they won't be successful, but having this fund can really help us understand that we have the financial capacity to go as far as we need to go to complete these cases. So I just want to provide that perspective on that particular issue.
Thanks, Travis. Eli, you ready? We have another question. So Ashley wants to know, what degree, if any, has OSU as the land grant university participated and assisted with land and water protection?
Wow. Okay. There's a lot there. So I think I would say it depends on the topic. like OSU, obviously on forestry issues, it's got one of the preeminent schools in the United States. And so they've done extensive work, and they have a significant number of people working on forestry issues. And I'm going to say from sort of all different perspectives too. I've attended some lectures at OSU in person prior to COVID, and like PhD dissertations. And there's some really interesting work being done at OSU. So I'd say, don't be afraid to go down the rabbit holes through their websites and see what they have. On the CAFO front, so Oregon State University is a land grant university, and like most other land grant universities in the US, they put out, they have an extension school, which runs, let's say, like the Master Gardener program. But it also issues guidances on animal husbandry and growing crops in a way that doesn't contaminate water supply. And so they also do research and studies on the CAFO issue. And a lot of the things that I was mentioning with respect to the permits that DEQ is issuing tie back to standards by, let's say, OSU Extension School. So that's definitely a resource when we're working on CAFO issues that we go back to look at. On the waterfront, OSU was involved in, and Travis, I'm going to get the name wrong, but it's like also like Willamette Water 2020. There was a big consortium of many different groups that did a study on Willamette River Basin water supply and allocation, and looking at the past and looking forward. And so OSU was heavily involved in that. And then the other piece of the OSU aspect that I'll mention is that they also have one of the best climate institutes in the US. And so they've been doing a lot of work on climate issues, looking at Oregon naturally. And so that's also a resource that I'll consult pretty regularly when I'm trying to, come up with arguments or come up with ways to think about something, or even educate myself as to what different positions are on climate and water issues in Oregon. Basically, they're an indispensable resource.
One thing we should also mention about OSU is their fisheries biology folks, and they have done tremendous work in the Willamette Basin over the past many decades, figuring out a whole lot of things that we now perhaps take a little bit for granted, but they've done some amazing work that has helped augment everything that we try to do in terms of protecting floodplain habitat, protecting riparian habitat, and of course the various river channels and stream channels themselves. So a lot of great people who still work there and who have worked there and retired over the years, who provided lasting contributions to our understanding of really how the Willamette as a river system works.
Okay, I think that is all of our questions. So Travis, if you want to close us out.
Yeah, thank you all again for taking a little bit of your time tonight to learn about some of the things that we're doing in the advocacy and legal realm, and kind of covering the span of issues that Eli talked about tonight. And if you have questions for us after this is over, feel free to get in touch. Our website provides easy ways to do that. And really thank you all again, and hope you have a great weekend. Looks like we're going to continue to get some rain here for a while. And of course we need it, but it's also kind of cool to see the rivers start to get big, and some of the tributaries as well. So have fun. Hope you're all doing well health-wise, and staying healthy, and we'll be in touch. Thanks again.
And just one more pitch. If you are interested, 2 weeks we're doing a webinar with our River Guardians and Habitat Restoration Program. And then Travis is going to do an end of the year roundup in the beginning of December. So thank you everybody for coming, and hopefully we'll see you in a couple weeks.
And someday we'll do these things in person.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
guys.
you,
Nice
everybody.
meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks,
Thank you.
Eli.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Peggy. I'm going to call you soon.